The desert sun was sinking low when the silence of the plains was broken by the pounding of hooves. Dust rose behind a lone rider, a man whose boots had seen more miles than most folks walked in a lifetime. His broad hat kept the glare from his eyes, but it couldn't hide the weariness that settled into the hard lines of his face. He wasn't chasing cattle this time, nor scouting for land to settle. No. This day he carried a different kind of burden, one he never planned on, and one that would shake the quiet heart of the village to its core. Because tied behind his saddle, bound but unbroken, was an Apache girl whose spirit blazed brighter than the desert sun itself. In those late years of the 1800s, the village lay nestled at the edge of the wilderness, a patchwork of wood and adobe built by hands that fought the land as much as they farmed it. The people who lived there had grown used to hardship. Crops failed, storms came, and sometimes riders never returned. Yet they found comfort in the rhythm of daily life church bells on Sunday. Children laughing near the well, the blacksmith's hammer ringing out at dusk. It was a fragile peace, one that balanced uneasily on the borders of a world still wild and untamed. The tension between settlers and the Apache was no secret. Stories traveled on the wind raids in the night, cattle gone missing, wagons attacked in the canyons. And just as often, the Apaches spoke of promises broken, lands stolen, and families torn apart. Each side carried their own scars, and suspicion had rooted itself so deeply that even a passing shadow on the horizon could set hearts racing. So when the rider appeared at the village edge with an Apache girl captured alive, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. She couldn't have been more than 17, yet her presence radiated something fierce. Her long black hair fell across her shoulders, even as the ropes cut into her wrists. Her dark eyes didn't lower, not even when villagers gathered, whispering in alarm. She stood tall, her bare feet sinking into the dust. And though she was bound, she looked more like a hawk in a snare than a prisoner. The people expected fear. They expected pleading. Instead, what they saw unsettled them a calm defiance. Like she carried secrets too sharp for anyone here to grasp. The man who brought her in said little. He claimed it was an accident, that he hadn't meant to catch her at all. He had gone into the foothills tracking a stray horse, only to stumble upon her near a canyon stream. One moment she was drawing water, the next she was struggling in his grasp. Some said he should have let her go. Others murmured that fate had placed her in his path for a reason. In a land where chance and survival walked hand in hand, no one truly believed in coincidence. Whispers spread fast. Carried from the saloon to the schoolhouse, from the church steps to the dusty porches where old men rocked in silence. What would be done with her? Would she be handed over to the law in the nearest fort? Would she be ransomed back to her people? Or worse, would she face punishment here among those who had lost kin in raids? No one could agree, and yet everyone knew one thing. Her capture would not go unanswered. The Apache did not forget their own. As night fell, lanterns flickered through windows and shadows stretched across the narrow streets. The girl remained calm, her eyes scanning faces, memorizing voices, as though she were carving every detail into her memory. The children peeked from behind their mother's skirts, curious and afraid. The elders frowned, sensing that the fragile stillness of their lives was about to shatter. Even the horses in their stalls shifted restlessly, as though they too felt the storm brewing. What shocked the village most was not that she had been caught, but how she carried herself afterward. In a place where silence usually meant submission, she spoke not in anger, not in begging, but with a quiet strength that unsettled even the bravest of men. She refused to eat at first, refused to bow her head. And when one of the women tried to offer her water, she turned away with dignity that bordered on defiance. Yet later, under the flicker of lamplight, she sang a low, haunting melody in her own tongue. It was not the sound of a captive. It was the song of someone who still believed she was free. By morning, the village was divided. Some feared she was a signal, bait to draw Apache warriors into their streets. Others saw her as a chance to strike a bargain, maybe even a fragile path to peace. The preacher urged caution, saying God tested men in unexpected ways. The saloon-keeper muttered that trouble was trouble, no matter what dress it wore. And the children, with eyes wide as moons, whispered of her as if she were a legend walking among them. But beneath all the talk and speculation, one thing hung heavy in the air, something no one dared say aloud. The girl had changed something the moment she set foot in their village. She had unsettled their certainty, stirred questions no one wanted to face. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the desert, every soul in that village felt it deep down. Whatever happened next would decide more than just her fate, because sometimes a single stranger carries with them a storm. And sometimes what shocks a village is not the arrival of danger, but the way one heart can spark a fire that no walls or weapons can contain, and that fire was only beginning to burn. Would you like me to extend this piece further so that it fully reaches around 1,200 words? With richer detail about the village life, the man's conflicted thoughts, and the growing suspense about what she might do next. The day after her capture, the village stirred with unease like a restless wind before a storm. Folks went about their business feeding livestock, fetching water, tending to their shops, but every movement seemed slower, every glance sharper, as if the entire town had grown watchful overnight. The Apache girl had been tied near the corral under the shade of a broad cottonwood tree, guarded but not hidden. Her presence was like a mark on the landscape, impossible to ignore. Men passed by, pretending not to stare. Women whispered in low voices, and the children kept sneaking looks, their curiosity stronger than their fear. The rider who had brought her in did not speak much. He leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching her with eyes that revealed little. Some said he was a fool to drag her into the heart of the settlement. Others whispered he was a man of luck, the kind that stumbled into things that could either make or ruin him. But those who knew him well noticed something unsettled in his silence, as though he carried doubts heavier than his saddle. He had said it was an accident, that she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the truth of it weighed on him more with every passing hour. The girl herself remained calm. She did not thrash against the ropes or cry out for mercy. She simply stood or sat in quiet dignity, her eyes scanning her surroundings like a hawk watching from a high cliff. She seemed to be studying the village, each building, each face, but as if she were gathering knowledge that might prove useful later. It gave the people a strange unease, like she knew something they did not. A few even muttered that she might have been sent deliberately, a spy meant to judge their weaknesses before her people struck at the general store. Men gathered on the porch and argued in hushed tones. One swore she ought to be handed to the soldiers at the nearest fort. Another muttered that it would only invite more blood, for the Apache were known to take vengeance when one of their own was mistreated. The blacksmith, with his hands blackened from soot, shook his head and said she was just a girl and ought not to be treated as a threat until proven otherwise. But even he admitted his words did little to settle the air. The village had lived too long in the shadow of raids and sudden violence to believe that anything could remain simple for long. That night, the preacher stopped by to see her. Lantern light flickered across his weathered face as he spoke gently, offering her water and a few words of scripture. She listened, but gave no answer. Only her eyes responded, dark and steady, reflecting both defiance and a quiet sorrow. When he left, he told the gathered crowd that she carried strength beyond her years, that perhaps her capture was no accident but a trial meant for all of them. His words unsettled more than they comforted. The people did not like to think of fate testing them in such a way. The mystery deepened when the girl finally spoke. It was not in English, but her voice was clear, calm, and strong. One of the older settlers, who had lived near the Apache lands for years, recognized enough of her tongue to understand fragments. She spoke of the river of spirits that watched the land, and of promises broken long ago. Some of her words seemed like riddles, others like warnings. When the man translated what little he could, a shiver ran through the crowd. It was not just what she said, but how she said it, as if she were not the one standing captive in their village, but they were the ones caught in something much larger than themselves. The rider who had caught her could not shake the memory of her capture. He remembered the moment clearly, the quiet of the canyon, the way she had turned at the sound of his horse, the sudden rush as he reached out and pulled her close. It had happened so fast, but now, replayed in his mind, it seemed less like chance and more like something inevitable. He had not seen fear in her then, only sharp intelligence in her eyes. It haunted him, made him question whether he had acted on instinct or on some deeper pull he could not explain. Days passed, and still no decision was made. Some of the villagers pressed harder, saying she must be taken away before trouble came. Others insisted it was too dangerous to move her at all, for the Apache might already be watching. Meanwhile, her presence continued to stir questions none dared to answer aloud. Why had she been alone near the canyon? Was she truly lost, or was she sent? And if she was sent, what message did her silence and her calm carry? The children, in their innocent curiosity, were the only ones unafraid to draw close. One boy, no more than 8, slipped her a piece of bread when no one was looking. She accepted it quietly, breaking it in half and giving part back to him. He took it and ran, wide-eyed, telling no one what had happened. To him, it felt like a secret pact, one that bound him to her in a way he could not explain. Small moments like these spread quietly through the village, adding to the strange sense that she was no ordinary prisoner. The desert nights grew colder, and yet she never complained. The wind carried coyotes' cries across the plains, and some villagers swore they heard drums in the distance, faint but steady, as if the land itself was warning them. Whether the sound was real or imagined, it set nerves on edge. Every snapping branch, every shifting shadow felt like the sign of something drawing closer. It was then that the rider began to notice changes in the village itself. The blacksmith worked more slowly, his mind clearly elsewhere. The preacher spoke longer at services, his words circling the idea of judgment and trials. The women hushed their children quicker, keeping them close at night. Even the saloon, usually alive with laughter and music, grew quieter, its patrons speaking in murmurs rather than boisterous shouts. It was as though the entire settlement was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the stillness would finally break. And through it all, the girl remained steady. She watched. She waited. Sometimes she sang, soft and low, the kind of song that seemed to belong to the earth itself. Those who heard it could not forget the sound. Some said it was beautiful, others said it was haunting, but all agreed it did something to the heart, stirring feelings they could not name. The rider found himself drawn back to her again and again, though he did not fully understand why. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps curiosity, or perhaps something deeper he dared not admit. Each time he looked at her, he felt the same uneasy truth capturing her had not solved anything. It had only opened a door, and behind that door lay questions and consequences he could not control. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the desert in hues of fire, the girl lifted her head and spoke again. This time her words were few, but the settler who understood her tongue paled as he translated. "She says her people already know," he whispered. "She says they are coming." The words spread like wildfire, burning through the village until every heart beat faster. Some reached for their rifles, others prayed harder, but none could shake the image those words planted. The Apache did not forget. They did not leave one of their own behind. And if what she said was true, then the village stood on the edge of something far greater than any of them had imagined. The night closed in, the stars wheeling high above the desert sky. Fires burned lower, voices quieted, but no one truly slept. The girl sat calm beneath the cottonwood, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as though she could already see what was coming. And in that heavy silence, the village realized that her capture was not an ending. It was only the beginning of something that would test them all. The nights grew heavier after her warning, each one pressing on the village like a weight no one could lift. Folks tried to carry on with their days herding cattle, mending fences, cooking meals, but beneath the ordinary rhythms ran a current of unease. Every creak of wood, every distant howl of a coyote set nerves on edge. The Apache girl had spoken so calmly, as if she knew without doubt that her people would come. And that certainty was worse than fear itself, for it left no room for denial. The rider who had brought her in felt the burden most. His silence became a thing of its own, noticed by everyone. He did his work, kept to himself, but his eyes betrayed him whenever they rested on her. Some of the townsfolk began whispering that he was cursed, that by laying hands on her he had brought danger upon them all. Others defended him, saying he had acted without thinking, as any man might in his place. But in a village already divided, his presence became a reminder of the choice they faced: to keep her, to release her, or to prepare for whatever storm was brewing on the horizon. Meanwhile, the girl's composure only deepened the mystery. She was not like anyone they had seen before. Even in chains, she carried herself as if she belonged to the land, as much a part of it as the desert rocks or the wide sky above. She did not cry for help or plead for mercy. She simply waited, and in that waiting, there was strength. Her silence unsettled them more than anger ever could. Some began to imagine she held powers they did not understand, whispering of curses or spirits. Others, especially the children, looked at her with awe, drawn to her presence like moths to a flame. One boy in particular, the same who had given her bread, became bold enough to visit her often. He would bring her small things: a cup of water, a scrap of cloth, a pebble polished smooth by the river. She accepted each gift quietly, never with thanks, but always with a look that lingered, as if acknowledging something deeper than words. His mother scolded him harshly when she found out, warning him that such closeness could only bring trouble, but the boy's fascination could not be curbed. To him, she was not an enemy, but a story come alive. Something beyond the narrow life he knew in the village. The preacher wrestled with his conscience as well. He spoke on Sundays of trials and mercy, of how judgment must fall with fairness. Yet in private, he confessed his doubts to his wife. Was this girl placed in their care by chance, or was it a test of their humanity? He feared the villagers would demand blood for the wrongs of the past, using her as a scapegoat for years of loss and anger. He wanted to believe in compassion, but he also knew how fear hardened the hearts of men. Each time he saw her in the shade of the cottonwood, silent and watchful. He wondered what kind of mark this moment would leave on the souls of his people. At the saloon, another subplot brewed. The barkeep, a man who had buried a brother after a raid years back, fueled talk of vengeance. He whispered to whoever would listen that the Apache only understood strength. The keeping her alive was a sign of weakness that would invite worse trouble. After enough whiskey, some of the men began to agree, their bitterness spilling out in angry words. A plan was even muttered once, late at night, to take matters into their own hands, but nothing came of it yet. Still, the tension was there. Hanging in the air like the smell of smoke before fire, the blacksmith's perspective was different. He had no love for raids or the bloodshed that shadowed the land, but he saw in her something he could not name. To him, she was more than just an Apache captive. She was a reminder that the world was bigger than fences and small disputes. He had lost a daughter years ago, buried young, and sometimes he caught himself seeing the girl through that lens, as though she carried the same kind of fragile strength his own child had possessed. It softened him, though he kept such thoughts to himself, knowing how the others might laugh or sneer. As the days turned, scouts reported signs of movement beyond the hills. Tracks in the sand, smoke in the distance, shapes moving at night where none should be. Whether it was truly the Apache or only nerves playing tricks, no one could say for certain. But the signs were enough to deepen the fear. The villagers began posting night watches. Men, standing guard at the edge of the settlement with rifles in hand, staring out into the desert darkness. Yet even then, they knew in their hearts that if the Apache came, rifles and lanterns would not be enough. The girl remained calm through it all. When questioned, she gave little, her words few and measured. Sometimes she spoke in her tongue, and those who understood fragments claimed she spoke of rivers, of winds, of promises. Other times she fell into silence so deep it seemed as though she had left the present entirely. Her gaze fixed on the horizon as though she could see what others could not. The people began to divide even further. Some wanted her gone, fearing she was a signal. Others argued that harming her would bring vengeance swift and brutal. The uncertainty became its own kind of enemy, wearing down patience and stirring old resentments. One night, as lanterns flickered and the air carried the chill of desert wind, the boy who often visited her overheard her humming. It was not a song he knew, but it was gentle, almost soothing. He asked her in a whisper what it meant, and for the first time she answered him directly in broken English. "It is for waiting," she said simply. The words lingered with him long after, a riddle that gnawed at his young mind. Waiting for what? Waiting for whom? He told no one, but the secret weighed on him like a stone in his pocket. Meanwhile, the rider who had brought her in grew restless. He began patrolling further from the village, his horse carrying him to the edges of the land where desert met mountain. He searched for signs, tracks, fires, movement, but what he found only deepened his unease. He saw evidence of camps recently abandoned, paths worn into the sand by many feet, and once in the dim light of dawn, a feather tied to a branch where no one should have been. He took it as a warning, a mark left deliberately. Yet when he returned, he told the village little. Perhaps he feared panic. Perhaps he did not want to admit, even to himself, that her words had been true. By then, the conflict was no longer just between the village and the Apache. It had become something deeper, a tearing within the village itself. Families argued at their tables, neighbors whispered suspicion against one another, and trust, once fragile but present, began to crack. Some wanted to arm themselves and strike first. Others wanted to release her in the hopes of peace. Still others clung to silence, afraid of what either choice might bring, and through it all, the Apache girl sat beneath the cottonwood, her eyes unyielding, her presence a mirror, reflecting their fears back at them. She did not need to move, did not need to speak. She had already become the center of the story, and the people, whether they admitted it or not, were caught in her orbit. The village was no longer simply living, it was waiting. Waiting for the moment the quiet would shatter. Waiting for the truth of her warning to arrive at their gates. The days bled into nights, each one colder, each one heavier. The suspense wound tighter with every passing hour, until even the horses seemed uneasy in their stalls. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it deep inside. The storm was drawing closer. And when it broke, nothing would remain the same. The tension in the village had grown into something almost physical, like a rope stretched too tight. Every day felt heavier than the one before, and every night dragged with a silence that pressed on the chest. The Apache girl remained beneath the cottonwood, her wrists bound, but her spirit unbroken. Her calm unsettled the villagers more than anger ever could. She did not look like someone defeated. She looked like someone waiting, and that waiting filled the people with dread. By now, the arguments had split the village into factions. Some wanted her gone immediately, believing that releasing her into the desert might spare them whatever vengeance her people prepared. Others shouted that to set her free would mark them as weak, and weakness in such a land was an open invitation to death. Then there were those, fewer in number, but stubborn in their belief, who thought she was not a threat at all, but a chance to change the endless cycle of suspicion and blood. Voices rose in the saloon, on porches at the well, until it felt as though the village was tearing itself apart before anything from the outside had even arrived. The rider who had captured her tried to stay apart from the noise, but the weight of his choice hung heavier with each sunrise. He saw the faces of men who had lost kin in raids, eyes sharp with anger, and he saw the children watching the girl with curiosity, their innocence still untouched by the bitterness of old grudges. Each look reminded him that what he had done was not simple. He had not just caught a girl in the canyon. He had changed the course of the whole settlement, and maybe of his own soul. Signs in the desert became harder to ignore. The night watchmen swore they saw movement on the ridges, silhouettes vanishing as quickly as they appeared. Tracks were found near the river, too many to be the wandering of lone hunters. Once, smoke rose in the distance, thin but deliberate, curling against the sky as though to say, "We are here." The men tightened their grips on their rifles, and the women kept their children close. No one slept deeply anymore. Dreams were broken by the thought of hoofbeats in the night. The preacher stood in the church longer these days, his voice trembling as he prayed for wisdom. He had begun to wonder if the girl was not only a test, but a mirror, forcing each person in the village to face what they truly were. Some revealed kindness, others cruelty, and many revealed fear so deep it turned into hate. In his heart, he feared the outcome, because he knew men in fear were capable of anything. The boy who had grown close to the girl carried his own secret. She had spoken to him more than once now, in broken English, always short words, but always sharp. She told him of the river, of the wind, of how the desert remembers every footstep. Once, she looked at him and said, "You see different?" He did not know exactly what she meant, but he felt it like a truth he was too young to understand. He kept this from his mother, from anyone, fearing that if they knew she spoke to him, they would stop him from seeing her. And in his heart he could not bear that thought. As days passed, tempers grew hotter. One evening in the saloon, a fight nearly broke out between two men over what to do with her. One shouted that she should be handed to the soldiers. The other swore that dragging soldiers into it would only bring worse bloodshed. Fists were raised, chairs toppled, and only the barkeep's shotgun laid on the counter kept things from spilling further. That night, the village seemed to sleep even less, haunted not only by fear of the Apache, but by the knowledge that their own unity was crumbling. The rider, restless and unable to shake the pull of the desert, began to ride farther each day. He found signs that grew clearer, feathers left on branches, stones arranged in patterns, a carcass of a deer stripped clean too close to their borders. These were not accidents. They were messages, warnings. Each time he returned, he carried the weight alone, unsure if telling the village would prepare them or only spark the panic that already smoldered like dry tinder. The girl's presence only deepened in its mystery. Sometimes she closed her eyes and tilted her head, as though listening to something beyond the hearing of others. At times, she whispered in her own tongue, words no one could understand, and those who overheard swore she was calling to the spirits or to her people beyond the horizon. Her stillness became unbearable to some, and more than once a man spat near her feet, shouting that she was nothing but a prisoner. But each insult rolled off her like water, leaving her calm, unbroken. And that calm became its own kind of power. The boy noticed what others missed that at night. When the guards grew tired and lanterns burned low, she would sometimes look east and smile faintly, a smile not of joy but of recognition, as if she could already see what was hidden from them. The boy told no one, but the sight filled him with both wonder and dread. Soon, villagers began preparing as if war were certain. Rifles were cleaned and stacked, ammunition counted, windows barred. Livestock was brought into closer pens, wagons pulled nearer the center of the settlement. The blacksmith worked day and night, hammering out iron for repairs, his sweat pouring while his mind carried the heavy thought of what was to come. The women filled sacks with flour and beans, readying for the possibility of being trapped. The sound of hammers, the smell of gun oil, the restless murmur of voices, it all built into a rhythm of fear that pulsed through every corner of the place. Yet, the real battle was already inside their hearts. Some feared the Apache warriors. Others feared their own neighbors more, knowing how desperation could drive men to acts that would mark them forever. The preacher begged for patience, for faith, but patience was thinning, and faith was being tested harder than ever before. One evening, just as the sun was setting and the sky burned red across the horizon, a shot rang out from the edge of town. The sound cracked the silence like thunder, and everyone rushed to the street, rifles in hand. The guard on watch swore he had seen a shadow moving too close. But when they searched, they found nothing, only dust, only tracks that vanished into the dark. Yet the fear had doubled. If shadows could come that near, then the time was closer than anyone wanted to admit. That night, the girl finally spoke louder than before. In halting English, her voice clear enough for many to hear, she said, "They come soon." The words spread like wildfire, whispered from mouth to mouth, until no one in the village could escape them. Men sat awake with their rifles across their knees. Mothers clutched their children tighter. And the boy, lying awake in his small bed, stared at the ceiling with her words echoing through his mind. The rider did not sleep at all. He sat outside, watching the desert, his hand resting on the rifle, but his thoughts circling the truth he could not escape. He had caught her by chance, or so he had told himself, but perhaps chance had never played a part at all. Perhaps this was the path laid the moment his rope caught her wrist. A path that now led the entire village to the brink of something it could not turn from, and so the village waited. The wind howled through the night, carrying with it the scent of smoke from unseen fires. The moon rose high, silver across the desert, and every shadow seemed alive. The girl sat beneath the cottonwood, her eyes fixed on the horizon, calm and unshaken. Around her, the people braced for what was coming. Hearts pounding, breath shallow, knowing the storm was now only steps away. The air grew so heavy with suspense it was as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The climax was near, and when it came, it would decide not only the fate of the girl, but the fate of everyone who had dared to hold her captive. The night of waiting stretched on until the air itself felt like iron pressing against the lungs. No one in the village truly slept. Lanterns glowed in windows, rifles leaned by doorframes, and horses stamped nervously in their stalls. The desert was too quiet, the kind of silence that meant something was moving just beyond sight. Every ear strained for hoofbeats, every eye searched the shadows. Beneath the cottonwood, the Apache girl sat still, her gaze locked eastward. It was as though she knew the hour had finally come. Just before dawn, sound arrived, soft at first, like a drum muffled by distance, then clearer. Hooves, many of them, steady and measured. The boy who had befriended her pressed his face to the window, wide-eyed heart racing faster with every beat of the earth. Men scrambled to their positions, women pulled children close, and the preacher whispered prayers into the dark. The rider who had captured her mounted his horse, his jaw set. Though his mind churned with doubt, shapes appeared on the horizon, riding against the pale light of morning. The Apache came not as scattered shadows, but as a force, proud and united. Spears and rifles glinted, feathers streamed from hair, and their horses moved with the grace of the wild. The village, small and fragile against the vast desert, seemed to shrink in their presence. Fear rippled through the people like wind through grass. Yet the girl beneath the cottonwood did not move. She only watched, her calm sharper than any weapon. The riders slowed as they drew near, fanning out just beyond the edge of town. Their leader, tall and stern, came forward, his horse stamping the earth. He said nothing at first, only fixed his eyes on the girl. In that silence, the people of the village felt smaller still, their breath caught in their throats. Then, in a voice deep and steady, he spoke words in Apache, and the girl answered. Her voice was clear, strong, not the voice of a captive, but of one who had never been broken. The exchange was brief, but it carried weight heavier than iron. The blacksmith, standing nearby, whispered that she was telling them she had been treated with dignity. Another man claimed she was saying the opposite, that vengeance must come. No one truly knew. The words, foreign and sharp, hung in the air like arrows not yet loosed. The rider who had captured her lowered his head, realizing how powerless he truly was in that moment. All his choices, all his doubts, had led here. And now the fate of the village balanced on words spoken in a tongue most of them could not understand. Then the girl rose. For the first time since she had been brought in, she stood tall and free, though her wrists were still bound. She lifted her chin and spoke louder, her voice carrying across the space between her people and the villagers. Though the words were not English, their meaning felt clear to all. It was a call for choice, a call for restraint. Her people listened, their eyes on her, their leader's face unreadable. The boy, trembling, broke through the crowd and ran to her side. Before anyone could stop him, he pulled at the knots on her wrists, fumbling with shaking hands until the ropes loosened and fell. Gasps broke out, shouts rose, but the boy did not falter. "She's not our enemy," he cried, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "She's not." His words, raw and unpracticed, struck harder than any sermon or speech could. They came from innocence, from a place untouched by fear's poison. The Apache leader watched, his eyes narrowing, then shifting toward the villagers. For a long moment, no one moved. The girl rubbed her freed wrist, then placed her hand gently on the boy's shoulder. She looked to her people, then to the villagers, her gaze like a bridge between two worlds divided by years of blood. Slowly, she walked forward, past the line of rifles, past the wide, frightened eyes of those who had whispered of curses and revenge. She stopped at the edge of the village, where her people waited. The leader nodded once, his face still stern. But there was a shift in the air, a loosening of the rope that had strangled every heart. He raised his hand, and the Apache warriors did not attack. Instead, they turned their horses, circling the village like a tide retreating from shore. The girl mounted behind her leader, and for the first time since she had been captured, her posture softened. She looked back once, her eyes meeting those of the rider who had taken her. No hatred burned there, only something deeper, perhaps recognition, perhaps forgiveness, or perhaps only a reminder that the desert remembers everything. When they were gone, the village stood in stunned silence. The preacher fell to his knees, thanking God aloud. Some men lowered their rifles with relief, others with frustration. The barkeep muttered curses under his breath, angry at what he saw as weakness. But the blacksmith laid a heavy hand on his shoulder and told him to hush. The boy's mother rushed to him, scolding and holding him all at once, though even she could not hide the pride in her trembling smile. In the days that followed, the village slowly breathed again. No raid came, no vengeance swept across their homes. Life returned to its fragile rhythm, children laughing at the well. The hammer of the blacksmith ringing at dusk, prayers whispered in the little church. But something had changed. The memory of that morning lingered in every corner. People spoke softer, looked longer into each other's eyes, as if they had been reminded of how thin the line between life and death truly was. The rider who had captured her spent long hours alone after that. He rode the edges of the desert, staring at the land that stretched endless before him. He thought of the girl's calm, of the boy's courage, of the choice that had nearly destroyed them all. He knew he could never undo what he had done. But he also knew he had seen something rare, the moment when fear could have swallowed them whole. But didn't. He carried that with him like a brand on his soul. The boy grew older, but he never forgot the look in her eyes when she placed her hand on his shoulder. To him, it was the moment the world opened wider than the fences of the village. He carried it into every step of his life, the lesson that people were more than the stories told about them. That courage sometimes came from seeing differently than those around you. For the rest of their lives, the villagers told the story in many ways. Some said the Apache spared them because of mercy. Others claimed it was fear of the rifles. But those who had stood there, who had seen the girl rise and speak, knew better. They knew it was her calm strength, and the boy's simple courage that had turned the tide. It was not the rifles, nor the threats, but the humanity that broke through the walls of fear. And so the desert held their story, as it held all stories, etched in dust, carried on the wind, remembered by the stars. The girl returned to her people, the village carried on, and the land endured, as it always had. Yet the memory remained, a quiet reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with weapons but with hearts. What the girl did next had indeed shocked the whole village, but not through violence or revenge. It was through the power of her presence, her dignity, and her choice to hold back the storm. In the end, the village was left with more than survival. They were left with a truth that could not be forgotten. Fear divides. But courage and compassion can change the course of even the harshest land. And so the story ended. Not with blood in the dust, but with a lesson written across the hearts of all who lived it. A lesson that would outlast the crack of rifles, would outlast the fading echo of hoofbeats, and outlast the endless desert winds that carried it into the future.